Welcome back to the final part of Hocus Pocus. Stick around for the end. I'll try to put a timestamp in case you fall asleep, which I hope you do, but also maybe you want to listen to the story. But I have some waffling to do that I will try to save for the end. But for now, let's get started with the final part of Hocus Pocus. "We did it," Danny cried as the kids ran whooping and shouting from the school. "We nuked him," Max shouted. "We terminated him," Allison yelled joyfully. She grabbed Danny and the two of them began to dance around the athletic field under the moonlight. Max stopped to catch his breath. He couldn't believe they had actually gotten rid of the witches. He felt incredibly relieved. Then he noticed Binks sitting on the grass, staring at the thin column of smoke rising from the school's chimney. Wisps of smoke curled past the full moon. "You did it, Binks," Max congratulated him. "You stopped them just like you said you would." "Yeah," Binks nodded, but he didn't seem happy. Max looked across the field at his sister, who was still dancing for joy with Allison. "Look at that nut job," he said. "She's a good kid," Binks said. "When she's not being a pain," Max said. "She reminds me of my sister Emily," Binks said with a sad sigh. Now Max understood. "You still miss her, don't you?" Binks nodded. "Hey," Max said. "You can't keep blaming yourself for what happened 300 years ago." Binks turned and looked up at him with yellow eyes. "Take good care of Danny," he said. "You never know how precious she is until you lose her." Max nodded. When it came right down to it, his sister was a pretty good kid, and brave too. Allison and Danny had stopped dancing and were coming toward them. Binks started to walk away. "Hey Binks," Max said, "where do you think you're going? You've lost your family, but you found a new one. You're a denizen now, buddy." Binks stopped and turned. "Really?" "Sure," said Danny. "We've got sunny windows to lie near, we've got fish in the backyard, and we don't have a dog. Come on, Binks, you're coming home with us." "Home," Binks repeated. Max had never seen a cat smile before. They headed home. It was very late now, and the town was quiet. The streets were empty, and the houses were dark. A few jack-o'-lanterns still flickered, but most had burned out. At his house, Max pushed the door open and led the others inside. "Mom! Dad!" he called. "Guess what?" Danny yelled. "We kept the cat." The lights were on, but no one answered. Max looked around and frowned. Could they still be under that spell? "No," Binks said. "When the witches were destroyed, the spell should have been broken." "Maybe they're still out partying," Danny said. They got Binks a bowl of milk and went upstairs to Max's room. Danny sat on the floor and petted Binks while he lapped up the milk. Max and Allison sat on Max's bed. Allison yawned and leaned her head on his shoulder. It had been a crazy, scary night, but Max was not displeased with how it was ending. "That was a great plan," Max said with a smile. Allison smiled back at him. "Couldn't have done it without you." They moved their faces close to each other and were about to kiss when Danny cleared her throat. "You guys." Binks finished the bowl of milk and yawned. "That moo juice really hit the spot," he said. "You're my kitty now," Danny said, petting him. "You'll have milk and tuna fish every day, and you'll only hunt mice for fun." "You're going to turn me into one of those fat, useless, contented house cats," Binks said, stretching out and closing his eyes. "I'll always take care of you, Danny, and then my children will take care of you, and their children after that, forever and ever." Danny's words trailed off as she fell asleep. Max realized Allison was asleep too. His own eyelids were getting heavy. Max didn't know how long he had slept, but suddenly he felt something stir and he opened his eyes. It was still dark out. Next to him, Allison was sitting up, awake. "Hi," he said with a sleepy smile. "Hi." Allison smiled back, then looked at the radio alarm clock. The red numbers glowed 4:29. "Oh God," she groaned. "My parents are going to kill me." She started to slide off the bed. Max reached out and stopped her. "You might as well stay out a little longer then," he said. He leaned toward her for a kiss. At the last moment, Allison turned her head and looked at the black sleeping cat on the floor. "Poor Binks," she said sadly. "Do you think we could help him? Maybe make him into a boy again?" "How?" Max asked. Allison pointed at the spell book lying on the floor, near the bed. "The witches used it to put a spell on him," she said. "There might be a way to take the spell off." "You mean like a spell remover?" Max asked, intrigued. "Like, maybe if you say it backward or something," Allison said, sliding off the bed and reaching for the book. "Hey," Max said. "Binks told us not to open it, but the witches are dead," Allison said. "I don't see what harm it could do now." "I don't know," Max said nervously. If anything weird happens, we'll slam it shut, okay? Allison said. She leaned toward Max and pressed her forehead against his. What do you say? Max nodded. If Allison had asked him to do a handstand on the roof, he probably would have agreed to that too. Allison put the book in her lap, then she carefully opened it. Neither she nor Max noticed that a strange, flame-like black and orange force floated out of the open book. They were paying too much attention to the book's reddish-brown ink. What kind of ink is that? Max asked. It's blood, Allison whispered back, sliding her hand into his. She slowly turned the stiff, warped pages. Here's something. Only a circle of salt can protect the victims from thy power. I'm not sure that's going to help Binks, Max whispered. Suddenly, a black paw slammed the book shut, and Binks jumped on top of it. Startled, Max and Allison sat up straight. I told you not to open it, Binks hissed angrily at them. We were just trying to help you, Allison explained. Well, don't, Binks snapped. Nothing good can come from this book. Allison shrugged and glanced again at the radio alarm clock. I better get home, she said. Wait, Max said, not wanting her to go. I can't let you walk home alone at this time of night, but I can't leave Danny alone either. I mean, the witches are gone, but Billy the zombie may still be out there somewhere. We could leave a circle of salt around Danny, Allison said. Then she'd be protected while you walked me home. Max liked that idea. They got Danny into Max's bed and pulled the covers up over her. Max took his pocket knife out of the drawer and went downstairs into the kitchen with Allison. He found a box of salt in the pantry and handed it to Allison, who read the label. Yep, it says right here. Pour a circle of salt to protect from zombies, witches, and old boyfriends. What about new boyfriends? Max asked, leaning toward her for a kiss. Once again, Allison turned away. Did you hear something? She whispered. No? Max wondered if Allison kept turning away on purpose. I'm sure I heard something. Allison said, I think it came from upstairs. Moments later, they stepped back into Max's bedroom. Danny was still sleeping peacefully under the blankets. Everything looked okay. Max, Allison grabbed his arm. The spellbook is gone. She was right. They'd left it on the bed, and now it wasn't there. Max quickly looked around. Binks was nowhere in sight. Where's Binks? He asked. He's gone too, Allison said, sounding scared. Max, this is weird. Max turned back to the bed. Danny, wake up, he said, pulling the covers back. But Danny wasn't there. Sarah was. Trick or treat, Sarah said with a wink. Ah! Max and Allison jumped back and screamed. The door of the closet flew open, and Winifred stepped out with an evil grin on her face and the spell book in her hands. Mary was right behind her, holding Danny tightly and carrying a sack with an angry meowing cat inside. Looking for this? Winifred asked, holding the spell book up. She and her sisters howled with laughter. Not knowing what else to do, Max suddenly charged her, but Winifred opened the book in his face, and a surge of evil green power knocked him backward. Crunch! Max smashed into the wall and slid to the floor, dazed. Max! Allison screamed and ran to him. Winifred shrieked with wicked laughter and followed. Allison quickly spilled the circle of salt on the floor around herself and Max. Salt! Winifred screeched. Such a clever little witch, but it will not save thy friends. Come, sisters, we must hurry. The candle's magic will soon be spent. Dawn approaches. We have children's lives to consume. Winifred raised her hands to the ceiling. Crack! She blew a hole straight through the roof. Holding the spellbook tightly, she picked up the old straw broom and flew off. Sarah mounted a dust mop and followed with Binks. Mary brought up the rear, holding Danny and riding a vacuum cleaner. Max! Danny screamed as Mary took off into the sky. Help me! Allison ran to the window and pulled it open. She watched as the witches flew off, silhouetted by the full moon. Her eyes went wide. She turned and shook Max's shoulder. Max! Max! What? Max slowly came out of his daze. Danny! Where's Danny? They took her, Allison said. What? Max rose unsteadily to his feet. I gotta get her. He staggered a few feet and then fell. Take it easy, Max, Allison said. But they're going to steal her life, and it's all my fault, Max moaned unhappily. I had to go and light that stupid candle. Suddenly, the sound of chanting floated through the gaping hole in the ceiling. It's Sarah, Allison gasped, pulling open the window. She's singing to the children. Max staggered to the window. Outside, dozens of kids in pajamas were wandering up the street like zombies. Hey, you guys! Max cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted. Don't listen to her. It's no use, Allison said. They ate the candy. They're under the spell. Max turned from the window and let his hands fall helplessly to his sides. They've already got Danny, and more kids are on the way. We can't make the sun come any faster. We really need a miracle. Allison nodded and stared out the open window. Then she turned to him. Max, can you drive? Max didn't know why she was asking, nor how to answer. The last thing he wanted to admit was that he couldn't drive. Finally, he just said, Hey, I'm from California. Great, Allison said, heading out of the room. I noticed the car keys on a hook in the kitchen. Let's go. The next thing Max knew, Allison was going down the stairs. By the time he caught up to her, she was already unlocking the passenger door of his parents' station wagon. She tossed the keys over the roof to Max. Let's go, she said. Max got behind the wheel and stuck the key into the ignition. The truth was, he did not know how to drive. But how hard could it be? It had to be pretty simple, considering how many adults did it. Max turned the ignition key. Nothing happened. It won't start, he said. Put it in neutral, Allison said. Right. Max slid the gear level into neutral and turned the key again. This time the engine roared to life. Lights, Allison said. Sure. Max looked around for the light switch. Finally, Allison leaned over and turned them on. We're a good team, she said with a wink. Yeah, Max said, relieved that she didn't make fun of him. He shifted into reverse. The car bucked and went back up. Parking brake, Allison said. Right. Max reached down and released the parking brake. When he looked back up, Allison was staring at him. Are you sure you can drive? No problem, Max said. Buckle up, Allison said, pulling the seatbelt across her chest. Max backed the car slowly down the driveway and out into the street. He started to navigate through the crowd of zombie-like kids drifting up the road toward the Sanderson house. As long as he didn't get pulled over by the cops, he figured he'd be fine. A little while later, Max crept slowly across the grass to the Sanderson house. Several dozen glassy-eyed kids surrounded the house, waiting to be summoned inside. Max slid past them and stared in through the window. He couldn't believe what he saw. Those two jerks, Jay and Ernie, were trapped in a cage hanging from a roof beam. They were barefoot, and Mary was pressing candy toward them. A big pile of empty candy wrappers lay on the floor beneath the cage. Stuff yourselves, Mary said merrily. No more candy, Jay begged. I'm gonna barf, Ernie groaned. Across the room near the fireplace, Danny was tied to a chair. Winifred stood over a cauldron of bubbling greenish goo, studying her spellbook. Soon the lives of all thy little friends will be mine, the witch cackled, and I will be young and beautiful again forever. It doesn't matter how young or old you are, Danny said. You sold your soul. You're the ugliest thing that's ever lived, and you know it. Max watched, petrified. He knew his little sister had a lot of guts, but she was crazy to aggravate a witch as powerful as Winifred. Winifred glared at Danny, who defiantly glared right back. Can you do this? Winifred yelled and viciously bit off a piece of her own tongue, spitting it into the pot. The goo turned purple and began to hiss and boil, giving off a menacing curl of purple vapor. I wouldn't even if I could, Danny said. You die first, Winifred said with a sinister chuckle as she dipped a ladle into the cauldron. Across the room, a sack kicked and jerked. Through the window, Max heard Binks shout, Don't drink it, Danny. Danny clamped her mouth shut. Winifred turned to her sisters. Pry her mouth open, she ordered. Do something, Max told himself, but it felt as if his legs were paralyzed with fear. Inside the room, Mary tried to force Danny's mouth open, but Danny bit her instead. Sarah stepped up next, and Danny kicked her in the shin. Now Winifred pointed her claw-like fingernails at Max's sister. Max knew Danny didn't have a chance. He had to do something. Now. Remember what happened to Binks, he thought. He didn't act in time, and he'd lost Emily. Winifred's hands were only inches from Danny. Max yanked open the door and burst into the room. Prepare to die. Again, he shouted. The witches spun around and gave him puzzled looks. Winifred smiled. Fool, she shouted. You have no powers. Maybe not, Max said, but there's a power even greater than magic. It's called knowledge, and I know something you don't. What is that? Winifred smirked. Daylight savings time, Max shouted. Suddenly, a bird began to sing outside, and the rosy light of dawn began to shine through the windows. The sun! Sarah screamed. We're dust, Mary cried. They rushed to Winifred and clung to her. Save us, Winnie, save us! In the confusion, Max took out his pocket knife and cut the ropes holding Danny, then dumped the boiling cauldron over. He grabbed the sack containing Binks. Hey, Hollywood, help us get out of here, Ernie cried from the cage. Max bent down. picked up the cross trainers, and waved it at the caged jerks. "Tubular dudes." He headed for the door, then realized Danny was just standing there. "Come on, Danny, let's go," he shouted. "Wait," Danny said. "I want to see them turn to dust." Max grabbed her and dragged her toward the door. "No, wait," Danny yelled. "I really want to see." "Huh?" Outside it was still dark. Allison was standing in the shadows, whistling like a bird. The family station wagon was parked nearby with red t-shirts covering its headlights to simulate the dawn. As they ran toward the car, they could hear Winifred shriek, "Let go of me, you fools! The sun rises in the east. That light is coming from the west." Max and the others reached the car and jumped in. "Head for the graveyard," Binks gasped. "It's our only chance." Max did a quick U-turn and started to drive back down the hill, once again weaving in and out of the sleepwalking children. "Wow," Danny gasped from the front seat. "It's a zombie pajama party." They got past the kids and picked up speed. Allison turned and looked out the back window. "Are they following us?" Max asked. "No," Allison said. An instant later, Max saw why. Riding the broom, dust mop, and vacuum cleaner, the witches were headed straight toward them. Allison and Danny screamed and ducked under the dashboard, but Max clenched his teeth and held the wheel steady. At the last instant, the witches veered away. "Great driving, bro," Danny yelled. Max had called the witches' bluff, but he knew they'd be back. He looked out the side window. Winifred raced up beside him. "Pull over," she shouted. "Let me see your driver's permit." Max swerved the car toward her. Winifred screamed as her broom veered off. Thwomp! She crashed into a tree. "Yeah, Max!" Everyone in the car cheered. A few minutes later, the station wagon pulled up to the old graveyard, and everyone scrambled out. Max grabbed a baseball bat from the back and took the lead. As he ran through the trees, one of them suddenly moved. Thunk! Max smashed into it and fell to the ground. The baseball bat went flying. He looked up and gasped. It wasn't a tree at all. Standing over him was Billy Butcherson. Max quickly reached for his pocket knife, but before he could get it open, Billy reached down and grabbed it. Click! The blade snapped open. Billy stood above Max with a knife in his hand. Max was sure he was done for. Billy raised the knife and cut the stitches across his mouth. To Max's amazement, the zombie breathed a sigh of relief. Dust, moths, and a horrible stench came out of his mouth. "It's about time," Billy sighed. He stared down at Max, who still cowered in fear on the ground. "Hey, I'm not chasing you. I hate those witches too. Let me help you." "You're a good zombie?" Danny asked in amazement as she ran up. "As good as a zombie can be," Billy replied. "Then come on," Max shouted, jumping to his feet and grabbing the bat. They ran through the graveyard until they came to an open space between the graves. "Okay," Max shouted. "This is where we'll make our stand." "Are you sure?" Allison asked. "No, but I don't think we have a lot of choices," Max replied. He held his bat ready. Allison took out the box of salt. Binks hopped up on Emily's gravestone and watched the sky for the witches. Billy led Danny to his grave. "You'll be safe in here," he said. "Thanks, Billy," Danny said, and got into the grave. "Here they come," Binks shouted. Max looked up and saw the three witches come screaming out of the moonlit sky like kamikaze pilots. Holding the baseball bat tightly, he ducked behind a tall headstone. As Winifred zoomed toward him on her straw broom, he jumped out and took a swing. Oof! The next thing Max knew, he was lying on his back. Hovering in the air above him, Winifred cackled. She had the bat in her hand. Sarah flew at Allison, who threw salt in her face. "Ah!" The pretty blonde witch screamed as the salt stung her. Straddling her vacuum cleaner, Mary flew at Danny. Billy stood in her way. Thwack! Mary kicked Billy's head off. It rolled away, and Billy fell to his hands and knees to search for it. Danny jumped out of the grave and grabbed Billy's head. "Here you go, Billy." She handed it to him. "Hey, thanks," Billy said. The witches hovered in the air. Max wondered what they'd try next. It wasn't long before he had the answer. Winifred grabbed the plug of the vacuum cleaner Mary was riding. The air around them crackled as the red-haired witch filled the machine with electric current. Vroom! The supercharged vacuum cleaner roared like a motorcycle and started to suck with incredible power. Max felt it tug on his hair and clothes. All around him, sticks and leaves were being sucked into the air. "Max!" Danny screamed. Max and Allison spun around. Mary had positioned the vacuum right over Danny, and it was sucking her into the air. "Grab her!" Max shouted. Billy lurched toward her, but it was too late. Danny was sucked up into the air and into Winifred's clutches. "Danny!" Max cried desperately, but Winifred held his sister tightly. Grasping Danny's hand in hers, the witch waved it like a doll's. Bye-bye, big brother, she cackled, hovering just above the trees. Max watched in horror as Winifred took out the vial and opened it with her teeth. It must be the potion, Allison gasped. The one that steals children's lives. Max! Danny screamed again, but there was nothing Max could do except watch helplessly from below as Winifred pressed the vial toward his sister's lips. With a sudden panther-like yowl, Binks leapt from a tall branch and knocked the vial out of Winifred's hand. It plummeted downward, but Max caught it before it could crash to the ground. Give me that vial or your sister dies, Winifred screamed as she threw Binks to the ground where he lay motionless. Let her go, Max shouted back, holding the vial aloft, or I'll smash it. It's the last vial you've got. Winifred closed her hands around Danny's throat as if to strangle her. What have I got to lose? She asked. Max realized she was right. If she couldn't have Danny and the potion, she'd die. So why not take Danny with her? It was a standoff. Max searched desperately through his mind for a way to save his sister. He had to come up with something. Anything. Wait. There was a way. The only way. Max pressed the vial to his lips. Max, don't! Allison cried, but it was too late. Max tilted the vial back and let the bitter potion drain into his mouth. It burned his throat and made his stomach churn wildly. Let Danny go, he shouted up at the witches. You can have me instead. Just as Max had hoped, Winifred dropped down and let go of Danny. The witch then reached for him, and Max allowed her to pick him up. His body felt hot, as if he had a fever. He felt himself begin to glow with the light of his life force. What a fool, Winifred mumbled in disgust, to give up thy life for thy sister. She burst into laughter. Max knew this was his only chance. He pulled his arm free and punched her in the face. Ah! They both tumbled off the broom and fell into the graveyard below. Winnie! Her sister shrieked as Winifred fell to the hallowed earth. Max hit the ground hard and lay there stunned while his life force glowed around him. Everyone stared at Winifred, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. Max turned and looked helplessly at Allison. Was the legend wrong? Winifred rose to her feet and aimed her long, pointed fingernails at Max. Why, you little... She tried to take a step toward him, but her feet wouldn't move. They seemed frozen to the ground. Suddenly, strange protrusions started to grow out of her back. Oh, no. No, she screamed. Max, look, Allison yelled, pointing to the east. Max turned and saw a pink glow. The sun was coming up. In the air above them, Mary and Sarah also saw it. If I'm not mistaken, sister, Mary said, that bright object over there is the... Uh-oh. The first rays of dawn broke through the trees and fell on Mary and Sarah. Max and the others gasped as they instantly turned to dust. Clunk. The dust mop and vacuum cleaner crashed to the graveyard ground. No! Winifred raised her arms to her face and tried to shield herself, but as the light hit her, her hands involuntarily clasped before her, and the growths on her back spread out like wings. Max and the others stared in amazement as she became gray and faceless like the tombstones around her. She turned into an angel, Danny gasped. An angel of stone, Allison said in wonder. Still lying on the ground, Max felt his glowing life force start to seep back into his body. Danny and Allison ran to him. Max, Allison cried, are you all right? I think so. Max got up slowly. Oh, Max, you saved my life, Danny said, throwing her arms around his neck. For the first time in a long time, he didn't mind her doing that. I'm your brother, Max said with a grin. It's my job. Danny hugged him. I love you, jerkface. Over Danny's shoulder, Max's eyes met Allison's. She was smiling, and her eyes were filled with admiration. Hey, guys. They turned and saw Billy the zombie standing up in his grave, waving at them. See you around, he said with a yawn, then flopped into his grave. A big cloud of dust rose. Where's Binks? Danny asked. There, Allison pointed to the spot where the black cat still lay. She bent down and nudged him, but Binks didn't move. I'm afraid he's really gone this time, Allison said sadly. No, he can't die, remember? Allison said, kneeling next to him. He's supposed to live forever. Come on, Binks, wake up. She petted the cat, but he didn't stir. Please, Binks, Danny started to cry. Please don't die now. The cat still didn't move. Danny looked up at Allison with tear-streaked eyes. But I thought he couldn't die. The witches are gone for good, Allison said sadly. Their evil spells are all broken. Look, Max said. A few feet away from them, the transparent figure of a boy appeared. He was dressed in a colonial nightshirt and sleeping cap. "Thackeray Binks, is that you?" Danny asked, wide-eyed. The boy nodded and held out his hands to her. Danny reached forward and their fingertips touched. A tear fell out of her eye. "Don't be sad for me, Danny," Thackeray said. "You freed me. I'm happy now. This is where I'm meant to be." "But I'll miss you," Danny said with a sniff. "Don't worry, I'll always be with you," Thackeray said. He turned to Allison and Max. "Thanks for lighting the candle, Max." "Thackeray! Thackeray Binks!" a voice cried. Max and the others turned and saw the transparent form of a young girl waving from across the graveyard. "Coming in," Thackeray called back. "Hurry," the girl called impatiently. "Father is furious." Thackeray nodded to the others. "Nothing changes," he said with a smile and a shrug, then started toward her. "What took thee so long?" Emily Binks asked in a huff. A moment later, they ran off and vanished. "Look over there," Allison pointed toward the street that led past the graveyard. Dozens of sleepy-faced, bewildered-looking kids were walking quickly toward town. Danny was still wiping the tears out of her eyes when she felt something rub against her leg. "Hey," she cried, bending down and picking up the black cat. "Binks, can you talk?" The cat just meowed. "That's okay. Meowing is good." Danny hugged the cat to her chest and turned to Allison and Max. "I guess he still had one life left." Max and Allison turned and smiled at each other. Max pulled her close. He almost expected her to turn her head away at the last moment, but this time she didn't. They shared a soft, lingering kiss. "So, did I make a believer out of you?" Allison asked, pulling back and smiling at him. "Yeah, you did." Max smiled back. "I'm glad." Allison started to lean toward him for another kiss. "Excuse me, you two," Danny said. "Can we go home, please?" "Sure." Max was so happy he lifted Danny up so she could ride on his shoulders. "You shouldn't have saved my life," Danny told him as she held onto his head, "because now I'm going to bug you forever." "I know," Max said, and he couldn't help but smile. The end. So I kind of have October and the holiday season type time period for the most part figured out. I think I know what I want to read, but I also was just kind of curious about what are people's favorite Goosebumps books. I have a few and a few Fear Streets, but I have no concept of what are the most popular or the most remembered. So if anyone has any input, I would love to know about it. I would love to know what your favorites were. So if you could comment them down below, and perhaps I could work those in. But just let me know. Just looking for some input. I really am looking forward to doing polls if ever I reach 500 subscribers, and then I can kind of have a little bit of input on what people would like to hear, perhaps. But until then, and until next time, sweet dreams.